Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to present the World Wealth and Income Database project, where it stands now and what are the planned developments. But, this is not working. So first, I'd like to start with the history of the project. As many of you know, the WID-World project started with the production of historical series on top income shares using tax data. So this includes Thomas's work on top incomes in France, the Piketty and Sarres series on American top earners, the 2 volumes edited by Tony Atkinson and Thomas Piketty in 2007 and 2010 on top incomes over the 20th century and top incomes from a global perspective, and many other works which are in fact the continuation of the pioneering work and methodology set up by Simon Kuznets in the early 50s and continued by Tony Atkinson and Alan Harrison in the 1970s. So in order to provide an easy and open access to this data, the World Top Income Database was created in 2011, and it was progressively extended to over 30 countries and to wealth. And earlier this year, the WTID, as Thomas said, was subsumed and transformed into the WID, which stands for World Wealth and Income Database. And it is truly a collaborative work in the sense that it involves the combination of the efforts of more than 100 researchers located on all continents, and without them there would be no WID-World project today. It's also the joint effort of a team of data optimization scientists based at Polytechnique University and a team of designers based in Paris. The key novelty in terms of data of the WID-World project is that we intend to combine national accounts, tax data and surveys in a systematic manner. Why we do this? Well, because if one of the objectives is to focus on emerging countries, for instance, well, tax data only gives information on a small fraction of the population in emerging countries. In emerging countries, the combination of different sources is particularly necessary. The other key extension underway at the WID-World project is the focus not only on the concepts of income but also on wealth distribution. And this has been carried out for 4 countries and is being extended to other countries. The support of all the distribution is what we now look at, and not only the top. One comment on emerging countries. A lot has been said on the evolution of inequality in the industrialized world over the past years, and some commentators actually argued, sometimes on the basis of survey data, that perhaps the evolution of inequality was not as important in emerging countries, or that the levels of inequality were not as important. Well, we believe that in order to have a sound data and to have debates on these issues, we really need to perform this combination of different sources. And from what we will present and what we are currently seeing at the World Inequality Lab is, as soon as we start to combine tax data with survey data in emerging countries, we see not only a rise in the level of inequality, but also we see that the evolution, the growth of inequality over the past decades also increases. Now, what was interesting in the whole debate that emerged from the capital in the 21st century and the World Top Income Database is that in some countries, pressure was put on governments to actually release tax data that was not available before. This is particularly the case for India, for instance, where under public pressure, the governments agreed to release tax data that had not been published since the turn of the century. So we are currently processing this information. So where does WID-World stand today? We see it as the most extensive database on the historical evolution of income and wealth. It is an truly open access database that is now available in 4 languages. So it reaches 3 billion people in their own language. But in fact, instead of reading this slide, I think it's more interesting to have a look at the website. So okay. So this is how the website looks like, and we see here the possibility to translate it into Chinese. I think we'll carry on the presentation in English. So let's have a rapid look at the kind of data that is on the website. Here, what we plot is the different countries for which we have top fiscal income share series. Very soon, this map will actually be filled with many more countries, including Russia, Middle East, Brazil, Mexico. And what we plot here is the evolution from 1900 to today of top 1% fiscal income share in this in a set of countries, which you can in fact easily add or remove from the graphs. Another important effort was made recently to actually provide net national income estimates for all countries in the world. And they are consistent with World Bank, IMF, or national accounts estimates of the different countries, but we do some refinements, and in particular we add missing net foreign incomes that is not visible in national accounts in many countries. Now, if we focus on a specific country to show you some of the functionalities of the database, let's take the US example. So here we see the evolution of the share of the bottom 50% in pre-tax adult national income in the USA in red. We see that it decreases from 21% at the start of the period to about 13% at the end of the period. And the mirror evolution of the share of top 1% in blue over the same period of time in national income. So moving upwards from 10.8% to close to 20%. In a few clicks, you can actually recover the average income level of these different groups. And this is what I've just done, where we see in red the complete stagnation of bottom 50% average incomes and the evolution of top 1% average income. What we've also tried to do is to provide non-technical descriptions of all the concepts that we use so that users can easily relate and make sense of these concepts. And we also provide all the methodological documents as well as the raw data sets or the computer codes that are actually underlying the data that is published online. You can, indeed, if you don't want to manipulate these graphs but produce your own graphs or treat the data on your own softwares, download the data, and we're in fact happy to announce on the occasion of this conference the publication of a Stata package that allows you to actually grab all the data from WIDworld directly into Stata. The information will be published online right after the conference, and you can see it on the news section. In terms of tools for researchers, Thomas Blanchet presented earlier this week on the occasion of an internal seminar this tool that we call GPinter, which allows you to manipulate distributions and to produce estimates of top income shares, top income thresholds, top income average, or for wealth distributions as well, using generalized Pareto interpolation techniques developed by Thomas Blanchet, Juliette Fournier, and Thomas Piketty, and which fare better than traditional Pareto interpolation techniques used before. This is, again, all available online, and it's also available directly on R, the statistical software. Before I close this small presentation of WIDworld, I'd like to go back again to the faces of the project, where you see the 100 researchers that contributed to the work and that are all presented here, and many of you are actually in the room. So this is where WIDworld stands today. And what's next? What's next for the project? So later this year, we will release the first World Inequality Report, in which we will discuss latest income and wealth inequality trends, their underlying drivers and potential implications. We will also bring a key novelty, which is estimates of the global distribution of income. So basically, we intend to merge different national distributions into a global distribution, and we intend to analyze the dynamics. The truth is that today, we know very little about global inequality dynamics. In fact, there is no global distribution based on a systematic combination of top and bottom income or wealth data. This is also true for wealth. That is based on this systematic reconstruction using national accounts, tax data, and survey data. So today, we don't really know what are the actual income growth rates of different global groups of the distribution. So our strategy is in fact to follow a step-by-step approach towards this objective, which is to construct a consistent global distribution of income and wealth. And we only merge together countries for which we have done this integration work following the distributional national accounts guidelines. So let me present a few preliminary results of such a global aggregation, where we're going to merge together China, Europe, where France is here taken as a representative for Europe. Very soon we'll be able to include other countries, but we already know that the results will be fairly similar to what we see here. India and the US. The first striking characteristic that we see from this table is the sharp increase in total growth rate over the period considered, that is 1978 to 2015, if we go upwards in the distribution of pre-tax income. So from 400% total growth for the bottom 50% earners in China to close to 4,000% if we look at the top 0.01%. In Europe, what we have here is bottom 50% growing at 32%, and the top 0.01%, 10 times more, 300%. India is somehow similar to China, and indeed the two countries did undergo a very profound transformation of their and deregulation of their economies, with very high growth at the top and high growth at the bottom in India, even though it is somewhat smaller than in China. And in the US, and indeed Emmanuel will discuss this more at length, you see the almost stagnation of bottom 50% incomes and important growth at the top. So the final column is the result of this aggregation, and in the final column you already see the silhouette or the shape of our curves of total growth by income percentile. That is high growth at the bottom, reduced growth as we go upwards in the distribution, and then growth that rises again at the very top. So how is this represented graphically? Well, this is the first result of this consistent combination of incomes at a global level, so limited to these four regions at the moment. Well, this has sometimes been termed as the elephant curve, with the silhouette of an elephant. We'll actually see more of a mammoth here than an elephant, in the sense that having this precise information on the top earners shows that the tusk of the elephant or of the mammoth actually rises very high. So, in fact, each dot here represents 1% of the global population, except for the dots over dot 99, where we explode the top 1% into 28 smaller groups. we plot these. We plot the total growth rate of each dot over the 1978 to 2015 period on the y-axis, and the x-axis actually represents the dots plotted on a population scale. So that is, the bottom 20% occupies the same length as the top 20%. We actually think that it may be interesting to also not only focus on the average or the total growth rate of each percentile, which makes sense from the point of view of individuals, but also on the share of total growth captured by each group over the period. So this is what we plot on this table. Let's only focus on the right-hand side column for the world, where we see that the bottom 50% group captured 14% of total growth over the period. This more or less corresponds to what the top 0.1% actually captured over this period. And we see as well from this right-hand side column that the top 1% earners at the global level captured 23% of total growth. And so this is somewhere between the bottom 50% and the bottom 70% of the population. I will give the precise figure right after. So, in fact, we move from our mammoth shape graph on the left to another representation of exactly the same data, but where we scale our income groups as the share they captured of total growth. So the top 1% captures 23% of total growth, and this is equivalent to the fraction of total growth captured by the bottom 59% of the population. So the question now, one of the questions that may arise from such a graphic is by how much would have bottom 50%, middle 40% grown with slower growth at the top? So what we believe is that carefully looking at total growth rates by percentiles for different countries can help us answer this question. But the bottom line, when we look at the different national trajectories, the different stories, is that we see rising top income shares in nearly all countries, but at different magnitudes. And we also see different trajectories pursued by bottom and middle income groups. So this suggests that there is no incompatibility between lower growth at the top and higher growth at the bottom, but also this reveals the importance of national level policy and institutions. But let's look more closely at these different stories briefly, as the time is running out, but Emmanuel, I think, will take time to focus on this American case. So in the case of the US, the top 1% captured the same share of growth as the bottom 88% of the population. And this is, the picture is quite different to that of Europe, again represented here by France, where we see that all percentile groups from the 20th to the 99th grow more or less at the same rate over the period, which is close to the average. And when we move on to the two emerging countries in our data set, China and India, we see these substantial total growth rates and growth rates at the very top as well. So in the case of China, the top one captured as much growth as the bottom 51%. And in the case of India, the top 1% captured as much growth as the bottom 75%. So we are back on our the initial graph, the elephant or the mammoth graph. What happens when we include more countries in this data set? Very soon, we intend to include Latino American countries as well as African countries. So it seems that if we include African countries, the shape of the body of the mammoth will probably be shifted to the left. And its size will also be shifted down. So at this stage, what can we say? Well, global inequality dynamics involve strong and contradictory forces. We see rising top shares in nearly all countries, but varying magnitudes and varying trajectory at the bottom. Overall, these preliminary results suggest that global growth was very unequally distributed over the period considered. The bottom 50% captured as much global growth as the top 0.1%. And we think that better data access is actually critical to monitor these dynamics and to better understand which forces will dominate in the future, as well as to design potential and appropriate policy responses. So WIDWorld is just one step in a long, collective, cumulative process to construct this data and to publish this data and to make it available to a wider community of researchers and general public. Other steps are planned or on the way, including gender inequality statistics. We're also investigating the inclusion of natural capital and offshore wells. The inclusion of offshore wells is also planned. And this gives me a good transition to leave the floor to Gabriel. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right. Thank you very much for being here. Thanks for having me. So I'd like to talk about one of the next steps in the WIDWorld project, which is to include estimates of tax evasion in the income and wealth distribution series that we have. And I'm going to present very quickly one step in that agenda, which is joint work with Annette Taltatsater and Niels Johansen, where we try to use new data that have become available recently from leaks, from the Panama Papers and HSBC leak, to study who conducts tax evasion and how that affects inequality. And so the whole motivation for this is that over the last 15 years, there's been a growing number of researchers who've used tax data to study distributional issues, and in particular top income and wealth shares. And of course, this raises an obvious issue, which is that tax data only tell you about the income and the wealth that people report on their tax returns, and not about their true economic income and wealth. And as you know, the top marginal income tax rates have changed enormously over time, from about 0% a century ago to about close to 100% in the US or the UK in the post-World War II decades. Tax evasion technologies have changed a lot. Tax enforcement strategies have changed a lot. All of these things vary across countries. And so, at a very basic level, it's not very clear on a priori grounds what you can learn from tax data to study the rich. And of course, people, inequality researchers are aware of that problem. In fact, it is probably one of the main reasons why between the 1950s, when Kuznets used tax data, combined national accounts and tax data to study top income shares in the US, and the late 1990s, early 2000s, when Thomas and Emmanuel and Tony picked up on this Kuznets agenda, very few researchers, Tony being a very important exception, thought that it would be a good idea to actually use tax data to study the long-run evolution of inequality and the cross-country differences in inequality. So inequality researchers are aware of this. The reason why, despite the fact that we are aware of this, if you want, there's never been any systematic attempt at correcting the tax data to take into account tax evasion, for the very simple reason that there's just no good, data set that captures tax evasion. Obviously, the key data source that's used in rich countries, it's random audits, where the tax authority randomly audits a number of taxpayers and then checks that whatever income is reported or wealth, if there is a wealth tax, corresponds to what should be reported. And that's how tax authorities estimate the tax gap, the total amount of taxes that should be paid but that are not properly paid. And that's also the key source that's used in the literature on tax evasion, where people look at these random audits to study the determinants, for instance, of tax evasion. The key problem with this essential data source is that it's not well suited to studying tax evasion by the very wealthy. For two reasons. One is that you have too few really rich individuals who are randomly audited. Okay, even though these random audits are stratified, so they oversample rich individuals, you don't have many people with more than $10 million or 20 or 50 or $100 million who get audited. And even when they get audited in those random audit programs, the tax authorities typically fail to capture sophisticated forms of tax evasion that involve legal and financial intermediaries, just because they can't ask all the banks all over the world whether that particular person has a bank account in Singapore or in the Cayman Islands. And so these audits are not great to study tax evasion at the top of the distribution, which means that you need to use other data sources to supplement these audits and to capture tax evasion by the wealthy. And the good news is that such data has become recently available. So what we use is two leaks. The most important one is the leak from HSBC Switzerland. So in 2007, an employee of HSBC Switzerland, Hervé Falciani, stole the whole file of all the clients of this Swiss bank, the Swiss subsidiary of the global banking giant HSBC. And then the French government got access to this list when Christine Lagarde was Minister of Finance, and so the list, which was originally known as the Falciani list, became the Lagarde list. Lagarde shared it with other foreign countries' tax authorities in the US, in Greece, in Scandinavia. And what we've been doing is that we've been working with Scandinavian tax authorities in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, and so through a cooperation with these tax authorities, we got access to the HSBC list. And we were able to match the names, the Scandinavian names, on that list, so people with unreported Swiss bank accounts, to their income and wealth tax returns. And what's great is that in Scandinavia, they have excellent population-wide, complete administrative data on income and wealth. And so what we do is that we do this exercise, which provides kind of the first evidence. It's imperfect in many ways, but I think it's relatively useful. The first evidence on tax evasion by really rich individuals, we combine that with stratified random audits in order to capture the entire distribution of tax evasion. And we do the same with the Panama Papers. And so very briefly, here is the key result. So that's a graph that shows for each group of the wealth distribution, P010 is the bottom decile, up to the top 0.01%. So for each bin, what fraction of taxes owed are not paid. So the tax gap by wealth bin, zooming into the very, very top bin. So top bin, here, the top 0.01% corresponds to people who have more than $50 million in net wealth in Scandinavia. And so on average, the macro tax gap in these Scandinavian countries is just small. 3% of taxes owed. That's the best estimate we have, combining the random audits and offshore wealth and the leaks. 3% of taxes owed are not paid. But then there's a very strong gradient within the very top group. So you really need to zoom into the very top of the wealth distribution to see substantial and very substantial tax evasion, up to 30%, the evasion rate for the top bin we consider. So by our estimate, the top 0.01% Scandinavians, so the 1,000 richest Scandinavians, they evade 30% of the taxes that they should pay, so 10 times the macro average. So let me explain briefly how we obtain this. The key source is the HSBC leak. It's very useful for a number of reasons. So first, it's kind of a random event. So there is this person, Falciani, leaks the files. It's not the product of some enforcement, targeted enforcement by tax authorities. Second, HSBC Switzerland. It's at the time of the leak in 2007, it was a very big, and the available evidence suggests a representative player in this market of the management of hidden wealth in Switzerland. So the data we have is that HSBC Switzerland managed about 5% of all the wealth managed by Swiss banks. There is actually very good data on the total amount of offshore wealth in Switzerland, about 2.5 trillion in 2007, and HSBC was 5% of this total, or about 2% of what I estimate is the total amount of offshore wealth in all the world's tax havens. So not only Switzerland, but also Singapore, Cayman Islands, and so on. And so, only in Switzerland you have 300, private banks. So this one bank is 5% of the total. It would have been even better if there had been a leak at, UBS or Credit Suisse, but it's almost the perfect leak, right? It's also useful because, incredibly so, most of the accounts held in these tax havens, they are held through anonymous shell corporations. So in the books of the banks and in the data, what you see is that you see an account that belongs to a shell company incorporated in Panama, all right, or in the British Virgin Islands. But HSBC Switzerland kept internal documents saying who were the beneficial owners of the account. So who was behind the shell companies. So we can actually link the wealth to its true owners in most of the cases. Not in all cases, but that's extremely valuable and important. So what do we see? So if you do a simple exercise where you compute for each bin of the wealth distribution, what fraction of people have an unreported HSBC account. And let me add another strength, and maybe the most important one of the HSBC leak, is that it gives a clear-cut indication of whether there's tax evasion or not. Sometimes it's fuzzy, you don't know, if there's tax evasion or legal tax avoidance. In that case, it's very clear. Of course, it's totally legal to have bank accounts all over the world. You just have to declare them on your tax return and to declare any income that you earn, any interest or dividends or capital gains. And so we do the matching and we can say, okay, that person was declaring the account, that person was not. And in about 95% of the cases, the accounts were not declared. So it's really, pure tax evasion. So we just count the number of people with unreported HSBC account in each bin, and so it rises like that across the wealth distribution up to 1%. So 1% of the richest Scandinavians had a hidden HSBC account. And of course, it's just one bank in one tax haven, but that's already something that's interesting. Then you can compute, okay, how much wealth were they hiding at HSBC as a fraction of their total true wealth, where you add the hidden wealth at the denominator. And here there's no clear pattern. It's about 40%, which is a lot. 40% of their total true wealth for all these tax evaders was hidden at HSBC. Now, you can do a similar exercise with the Panama Papers, just counting the number of people who appear in the Panama Papers. So by the way, the names in the Panama Papers are public, which is not the case for the HSBC list. So in some sense, it's simpler to do. The drawback of the Panama Papers is that it's unclear whether there is tax evasion involved. So the tax authorities are still investigating the cases. There's no clear smoking gun, but again, you see a clear pattern. At least the use of tax havens rises sharply with wealth. We look at a third type of data, which is tax amnesty data, where the tax authorities says you can declare previously hidden assets in exchange for reduced penalties. And so in Norway and in Sweden, we have access to these amnesty data. And so again, you can just count the number of people in each bin of the wealth distribution who use the amnesty. So here the numbers are pretty large. That is, the top 0.01% richest Scandinavians, 14% of them in recent years have just said, oh yes, we were evading taxes. Let's use a tax amnesty. Let's avoid, jail time or, penalties and so on and so on. It's the same pattern, of a very rising gradient in evasion by wealth bins. Now, what is probably the most important and in many ways striking results is on this graph. This graph shows what fraction of the wealth hidden at HSBC Switzerland or the wealth disclosed during the amnesties belongs to the various groups of the wealth distribution. And it contrasts this with the distribution of non-hidden wealth. So maybe let's start with this. That's the white curve. Wealth that we can observe in Scandinavia is distributed a bit like in France, a bit more equally than in France, but basically the bottom 50% has zero net wealth on net. The middle 40% has about 40% of total wealth, and so on and so on. And the top groups, the top 0.01%, for instance, has about 4% of total wealth. The wealth that's hidden in tax havens obviously is distributed differently, but really massively differently. That is, if you look at what fraction of offshore wealth in these two data sets belongs to the top 0.1%, so you add the last two dots, it's 80%. So 80% of all hidden wealth belongs to the top 0.1%. About 50% belongs to the top 0.01%, which was really not obvious because many people, especially at the time, said, okay, that's a form of tax evasion, maybe that has become more democratic. And it's true that at that time, hundreds of thousands of people had undeclared Swiss bank accounts, and so you might have thought, no, it's not going to be so concentrated. But in actual fact, even though there are hundreds of thousands of accounts, in terms of amounts, it is super concentrated. And so then, to move from there to the implications for inequality, it's simple to see that it is all going to depend on how big the macro stock of offshore wealth is. If it's big and 80% of it belongs to the top 0.1%, that's going to make a big difference. If it's small, it's going to make less of a difference. So what do we know about this? So we are in Scandinavia, which, the Scandinavians, they are not the kings of tax evasion on aggregate. If you, contrast their share of world GDP on the x-axis with the share of the wealth managed by Swiss banks on the y-axis, you see these three Scandinavian countries, they're all way below the 45-degree line. That is, they have less wealth in Switzerland than what you would expect just based on their economic size. And then you have a number of countries that are way above the 45-degree line. You have Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, France, Italy. So the point here is just that Scandinavian countries, they don't have so much wealth offshore in total. In the case of Norway, for instance, where there's good historical series, the estimate we have is Norway has 2.5% of its total wealth at the time of the leak in tax havens. 80% of it belongs to the top 0.1%, and so you see you need to add 2 points to the top 80% of 2.5% to the top 0.1% wealth share. That is, the true top 0.1% wealth share is 10% and not 8% as we can estimate with the extraordinary good Norwegian data that exists. Now, if you go to the very, very top, the gap is even bigger. That is 25% of the true wealth of the top 0.01%. You can't see it in the administrative data. That is, you need to multiply by 1/3 the wealth of the top 0.01% if you want to capture their true, level of wealth and their true wealth share. So that's, that even the point is that this is a big adjustment, even in economies. We're talking about Norway, Sweden, Denmark, even in economies that are not hiding so much wealth. Okay, even in those countries, if you want to study the very, very rich, you need to pay close attention to tax evasion and to all the stuff more generally that you don't see in tax data. Let me discuss very briefly how we construct then our estimates of the tax gap and the main sources of uncertainty. So clearly the main source of uncertainty in all of this is not how offshore wealth is distributed, which in these two sources, the Amnesty data, the HSBC data is very similar, is the macro stock of offshore wealth. So you might say, oh, I don't believe your estimate that Norwegians have 2.5% of their total wealth in tax havens. It's true that the data for the tax havens other than Switzerland is not as good as in Switzerland, so there are sources of uncertainty. So what we do is that we construct a lower bound scenario where we assume that Scandinavians have zero wealth outside of Switzerland. Okay? So the lower bound scenario corresponds to this curve here, where the top 0.01% evades at least 12% of its taxes through unreported offshore accounts. In that case, only Swiss accounts. The upper bound scenario is, let's assume they have as much wealth in tax havens as the average country, as the world as a whole, which is something like 4.5% of the world's total wealth. In that case, they evade about 45% of all their taxes. And even the lower bound, 12%, that's going to be 3 times more than what you see in the stratified random audits. So really the point here is that you can't properly study tax evasion just with these stratified random audits. You don't see so much tax evasion at the top of the wealth distribution. Okay, so let me discuss quickly 2 things. One is a simple explanation of why tax evasion seems to be rising so much with wealth. And so the question here is, in all the literature on tax evasion focuses on the demand for tax evasion services. Why do some people evade taxes? The marginal tax rate matters, the probability of being caught matters, and so on and so on. The penalty matters. But nobody has really talked about the supply side. There's a supply. There are financial intermediaries, legal intermediaries that facilitate tax evasion. So very concretely, they are going, let's say, to organize galas or golf events and invite some persons to these fancy events. So they don't invite me. They don't invite you. So who do they invite? So that's the question that we want to answer. So who do they supply tax evasion services to? And so we have a simple model where we try to just say a simple thing, which is that banks. It's a model of Swiss banks, which historically have operated as a monopoly, as a cartel. So we modeled that as a monopoly, and where they just choose the number of customers that they are going to serve. Okay, and so they charge theta per dollar of wealth hidden. To simplify, let's say they take demand as given, infinitely elastic demand at price theta. They manage K of S in wealth when they serve the top S% of the wealth distribution. In that case, they earn theta times K of S in revenue. What the bank does, what the cartel does, is that very simply, there's just one idea in that model. The cartel is just going to internalize the cost of being caught. That is, the more clients you have, the greater the probability that you're going to be found helping tax evasion, either because one of your clients is going to be detected by the tax authority, or because when you have tons of clients, then you need lots of Hervé Falcianis to manage the wealth, and one of them is maybe going to leak the data. So the probability of a leak increases. And so the bank internalizes this cost, which, let's say, there's a probability lambda times S to be caught, which triggers a fine phi. And so there's a first order condition that just says that the marginal revenue of servicing an extra client is equal to the marginal cost. And if you make the assumption that wealth is Pareto distributed at the top, then you get a very simple closed form formula for the supply of tax evasion services, which depends on basically 3 things: inequality, penalties if the bank is caught, and fines if the bank is caught, and the probability that the bank is caught. It depends on inequality with this B parameter here, the Pareto or the inverted Pareto-Lorentz coefficient. The more inequality you have, so the higher the B coefficient, the lower the supply. The bank is just going to focus on just a few super wealthy clients. If the world is relatively more equal, then the bank is going to invite not only people who have $200 million to its golf events, but also people who have 100, 50 million, 40 million, and so on. Okay? So, last thing in the remaining 2 minutes, the one takeaway of this model is that you can reduce tax evasion very easily if you're a government, a tax authority, by increasing phi, the penalty for the providers of tax evasion services. Let's say you make phi infinite, which concretely means you put out of business banks that are convicted of facilitating tax evasion, then you can reduce the supply to zero. Okay, so that's a message of hope, if you want. Does it mean that the government can, by fighting tax evasion, can collect more tax revenue from the very wealthy? Well, this is going to depend then on the extent to which there is substitution between illegal tax evasion and legal tax avoidance. You can imagine a scenario where tax evasion becomes much more complicated, but what happens is that there are tons of tax avoidance opportunities, and so very wealthy people just find legal ways to not pay a lot of taxes. And so we study this substitution question by looking at a tax amnesty in Norway. We see people who, at some point, they decide to use a tax amnesty, so they used to hide a lot of wealth, they decide to come clean. Do they start avoiding more taxes? So that's the number of people who use the tax amnesty every year. We apply a very simple event study design to this. And just 3 graphs and I'm done. One is what happens to your declared wealth at the time you use the tax, when you use the tax amnesty. The wealth you declare to the tax authority jumps 60%. Okay, so they were hiding a lot of wealth. They use a tax amnesty. The wealth they report to the Norwegian tax authority increases 60%. What happens to your taxable income increases by about 20-25%. And what happens to the taxes that they pay, they rise just in line with the increase in their reported income and wealth by about 30%. The result here is that even 4 years after the tax amnesty, they're still paying 30% more in taxes than before the amnesty relative to people who did not use the tax amnesty. And so there is no evidence that there was that there is any, in fact, in that sample, in that context, any substitution towards aggressive forms of tax avoidance. And we look at whether they create more holding companies, whether they invest in forms of assets that are taxed at low tax values and so on, and they don't do that. So they just pay much more taxes than they used to. Okay, so of course it's just, it's a specific context, it's a tax amnesty in Norway, but it at least shows that it's possible to collect much more tax revenue from very wealthy individuals under current law, so without changing tax rates and so on. And so my conclusion is that, well, in rich economies where self-employment is small, tax evasion is small on aggregate, just because most income is third-party reported by employers in particular, but it is high at the very top with a strong gradient within the top 1%. This can be explained by a model where suppliers of tax evasion services internalize the cost of being caught. And both the model and the available evidence suggest that collecting more revenue from the wealthy is possible under current law. And that's my last slide, just to mention that this is a very first step towards a broader agenda that will try to construct such distributional tax gaps for as many countries as possible. So the data exists in the US, in Latin American countries. We're working with the IRS, and we are trying to work with tax authorities in Latin America to do the same type of work. And the ultimate goal is to be able to correct, in a systematic way, the distributional national account series we have, the WID.world series that we have on income and wealth inequality. Thank you very much.